The rain had stopped 2 hours ago, but water still dripped from the bunker ceiling onto Corporal Werner Hoffman's radio equipment. He wiped the dials with his sleeve for the 100th time that night, listening to the static that filled his headphones like the hiss of distant waves. It was 3 in the morning on June 6, 1944, and somewhere out there in the darkness, something was wrong. The first report came at 0015 hours. Paratroopers spotted near St. Mireglès. Werner wrote it down and passed it to his sergeant, who frowned and set it aside. False alarms happened every week. The Allies dropped dummy parachutists to confuse German defenders. Rubber men filled with firecrackers, designed to make soldiers chase shadows. This was probably nothing, but then came another report. And another. Paratroopers near Cannes. Gliders landing in fields east of the Orne River. Transport aircraft filling the sky over the Cotentin Peninsula. Werner's hand began to shake as he wrote. The reports were coming from everywhere at once, scattered across 100 kilometers of Norman coastline. This was not a feint. This was not rubber dummies. This was something massive. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, commander of Army Group B and the man responsible for defending France against invasion, was not there to receive these reports. He was in Germany, at his home in Hurlingen, celebrating his wife Lucy's birthday. He had checked the weather forecasts before leaving and seen nothing but storms predicted for the Channel. No invasion could come in such conditions. He had been wrong that in Paris, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the 70-year-old Supreme Commander West, received fragmented reports in his headquarters at Saint-Germain-en-Laye. He had been a soldier since before the First Great War, had conquered Poland and France, had pushed deep into Russia. His instincts told him this was not the main attack. The real invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, where the Channel was narrowest, where the massive Allied army under General Patton waited. Normandy was a distraction. He was certain of it. Werner tried to reach Rommel's headquarters at La Roche-Guyon, but the lines were jammed. He tried the 7th Army Command post at Le Mans, but got only static. The Allied paratroopers had not landed randomly. They had dropped precisely on communication nodes, cutting telephone wires, destroying relay stations. The German command structure, built on rigid hierarchy and centralized control, was being blinded and deafened in the crucial first hours. At 0200, the situation grew worse. Reports indicated that British gliders had captured 2 bridges over the Orne River and the Caen Canal intact. These bridges would allow Allied tanks to push inland once the beaches were secured. German commanders understood their importance, but the troops needed to retake them were scattered, confused, waiting for orders that could not reach them. The greatest irony was that Germany had the forces to crush this invasion. 2 panzer divisions, the 12th SS Hitlerjugend and the Panzerlehr, sat in reserve near Paris, their tanks fueled and ready. These were elite formations, equipped with the fearsome Tiger and Panther tanks that had shattered Soviet armored attacks on the Eastern Front. A swift counterattack at dawn could push the paratroopers into the sea before the main landings even began. But these divisions could not move without direct orders from Adolf Hitler himself. And Hitler, at his mountain retreat in Berchtesgaden, had taken sleeping pills and gone to bed. Werner watched the clock on the bunker wall tick toward 0400. His sergeant had gone to find someone, anyone, with the authority to make decisions. He had not returned. Outside, Werner could hear the distant rumble of aircraft engines, hundreds of them, a sound like continuous thunder rolling across the sky. The largest airborne operation in history was unfolding above his head, and he could do nothing but write down reports that no one read. At 0530, the naval bombardment began. Werner felt the ground shake beneath his feet. Through the bunker's narrow observation slit, he saw flashes on the horizon, brief orange blooms that flickered and died. The Allied fleet had arrived. 6 battleships, 23 cruisers, and over 100 destroyers were pouring fire onto the German coastal defenses. The Atlantic Wall, which Hitler had called impregnable, was being hammered apart. Werner finally reached a junior officer at 7th Army headquarters. His voice cracked as he delivered his report, listing the coordinates of enemy landings, the estimated numbers, the growing chaos. The officer on the other end was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, and his words carried the weight of terrible understanding. "Get this to everyone you can reach," he said. "Tell them the invasion has begun." Dawn was breaking over Normandy. On the beaches codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, the first landing craft were approaching the shore. Inside them, American, British, and Canadian soldiers gripped their rifles and prayed. On the bluffs above, German defenders manned their machine guns and waited. And in command posts across France and Germany, officers stared at maps and telephones, paralyzed by a system that demanded permission before action, trapped by a hierarchy that valued obedience over initiative. The longest day had begun. The Berghof sat high in the Bavarian Alps, surrounded by pine forests and mountain air so clean it hurt to breathe. Inside this retreat, far from the blood and smoke of Normandy, Adolf Hitler slept. His personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morel, had given him his usual cocktail of sedatives and vitamins the night before. The Führer rarely slept before 3 in the morning and never rose before noon. His staff knew better than to disturb him. In the anteroom outside Hitler's quarters, 2 officers stood in uncomfortable silence. Colonel Heinz Brandt and Major Gerhard Engel had been receiving reports since before dawn. The situation in Normandy was deteriorating by the hour. Allied troops had established beachheads at multiple points along the coast. The airborne landings, initially dismissed as diversions, had proven devastatingly effective. And still, the Panzer Reserve sat motionless, waiting for an order that only one man could give. "We must wake him," Brandt said, keeping his voice low. "Every minute costs us." Engel shook his head. "You know what happened to Schmundt when he woke him during Stalingrad." The Führer raged for an hour. Nothing productive came of it. This was the poison at the heart of the Nazi command structure. Hitler had systematically destroyed the independence of his general staff, demanding personal approval for operational decisions down to the battalion level. In Russia, this had led to disasters when divisions could not retreat from impossible positions because permission never came. Now, the same paralysis gripped the Western Command. At OKW headquarters in Berlin, General Alfred Jodl received the morning reports with professional calm. Jodl was Hitler's chief of operations staff, a man who had learned to survive by never contradicting his master. He studied the maps, noted the landing sites, and reached a conclusion that would prove catastrophically wrong. This was not the real invasion. The main blow would fall at Pas-de-Calais, where the German 15th Army waited with its strongest divisions. Normandy was a feint, designed to draw reserves away from the true target. Jodl's certainty was not mere stubbornness. Allied deception operations had been remarkably successful. Operation Fortitude had created an entire phantom army under General Patton, complete with inflatable tanks and fake radio traffic. German intelligence was convinced this force would lead the invasion at the narrowest point of the channel. Even now, with real soldiers dying on real beaches, Jodl could not shake this belief. In Paris, von Rundstedt swallowed his pride and made a request. He asked OKW to release the Panzer Reserves for an immediate counterattack. His message reached Jodl at 0430. Jodl refused. The reserves would not move until the situation clarified. Translation: until Hitler woke up and made a decision. Hours passed. On Omaha Beach, American soldiers of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions were being slaughtered. German machine gunners in concrete bunkers poured fire into the landing craft. Bodies piled at the waterline. Officers died within seconds of touching the sand. For a terrible hour, it seemed the invasion might fail at this single point. But there were no German reserves to exploit the crisis. The panzers that could have pushed the Americans back into the sea remained parked in their assembly areas, engines cold, crews waiting. It was not until 1,000 hours that Hitler finally woke. His valet brought him the news with his morning tea. The Führer listened, asked a few questions, then surprised everyone with his reaction. He was pleased. He believed the invasion was exactly what Germany needed, a chance to destroy the Allied armies in a decisive battle, then turn full attention back to Russia. He saw opportunity where his generals saw disaster, but even Hitler's optimism came with fatal delays. He authorized the release of the Panzer reserves at 1400, nearly 14 hours after the first paratroopers had landed. And he attached conditions. The tanks could only move at night, to avoid the swarms of Allied fighter bombers that ruled the daylight skies. Divisions that could have reached the beaches by noon would not arrive until the following day. In his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon, which he had finally reached after a desperate drive through the French countryside, Rommel received the news with cold fury. He had argued for months that the invasion must be stopped on the beaches in the first 24 hours or not at all. Once the Allies established a foothold, their overwhelming air and naval superiority would make any counterattack suicidal. Now those 24 hours were slipping away, wasted by men who would not wake and men who could not decide. Rommel picked up his telephone and called 7th Army headquarters. His voice was flat, controlled, but those who knew him could hear the despair beneath. What forces do we have that can move immediately? The answer was not enough. It would never be enough. The moment had passed. The war had turned on the sleep schedule of one man in a mountain house, and nothing could turn it back. The map table at La Roche-Guyon was covered with red and blue markers, each one representing units that existed increasingly on paper only. Rommel stood over it, his face lit by the yellow glow of overhead lamps, listening to his chief of staff describe losses that grew worse with every report. The 716th Infantry Division had been shattered. The 352nd, which had inflicted such terrible casualties on Omaha Beach, was down to half strength. Coastal batteries that had taken years to build were silent, destroyed by naval gunfire or abandoned by crews who could not survive the bombardment. It was late afternoon on June 6. The beaches were lost. Rommel knew this, even if Berlin did not. The question now was what happened next. General Friedrich Dahlmann, commander of the 7th Army, arrived at headquarters looking like a man who had aged 10 years in 12 hours. He had been responsible for the Normandy sector. The failure was his failure, and he knew the price of failure in Hitler's Germany. He spoke quickly, laying out a plan for counterattack using the panzer divisions now being released from reserve. Rommel listened without expression. When Dahlmann finished, Rommel asked a single question. How will your tanks reach the coast without being destroyed from the air? Dahlmann had no answer. The Allied air forces had achieved complete supremacy over the battlefield. Any vehicle that moved in daylight became a target. Tank columns that should have traveled 50 kilometers in 2 hours would take 50 hours, crawling through the darkness, hiding in forests and villages during the day. By the time they reached the front, the Allied beachhead would be reinforced and expanding. The argument that followed was bitter and futile. General Leo Gere von Schweppenberg, commander of Panzer Group West, insisted on concentrating his armor for a massive blow against the British sector near Caen. He was a tank officer of the old school, trained in the doctrine of massed armored warfare that had conquered France in 1940. Rommel disagreed. He wanted the panzers dispersed, used in small counterattacks to slow the Allied advance rather than gathered for a set-piece battle that Allied aircraft would destroy before it began. Neither plan mattered. In Berlin, Hitler had his own ideas. He issued orders directly to division commanders, bypassing the chain of command entirely. Units were told to hold positions that could not be held, to attack objectives that no longer existed. The rigid control that had served Germany in the war's early years now strangled its defense. At 1800 hours, Rommel stepped outside the chateau for the first time since arriving. The evening air was warm and still. In the distance, he could hear the continuous rumble of artillery, a sound that had not stopped since dawn. Somewhere to the north, young men were dying in hedgerows and orchards, fighting over fields that would be remembered by strange names on English and American maps. Sword. Juno. Gold. An aide approached with a decoded message from OKW. Hitler had spoken to Mussolini by telephone and assured him the invasion would be crushed within days. The Führer remained convinced that Normandy was a diversion. The real attack would still come at Calais. Therefore, the powerful 15th Army would remain in place, waiting for an invasion that would never come. Rommel crumpled the message and let it fall. He had served Hitler for 4 years, had believed in him once, had accepted the Knight's Cross from his hands. Now he saw clearly what others in the officer corps had seen for months. The war could not be won. Germany was fighting 3 of the world's greatest industrial powers, America, Britain, and the Soviet Union, with an economy already exhausted and a military bled white on the Eastern Front. The invasion changed nothing except the timeline. The end would come faster now. Inside the chateau, the arguments continued. Dahlmann wanted reinforcements. Gare wanted permission to maneuver. Staff officers wanted guidance that no one could provide. The telephone rang constantly with demands from Berlin, questions from subordinate units, reports of new Allied advances. The machine of German military bureaucracy ground on, producing orders and memoranda while the real decisions were made by events on the ground. At midnight, Rommel summoned his closest staff officers to his private quarters. What was said in that room was never recorded, but those who were present later described the conversation in careful terms. The field marshal spoke of Germany's future, of the need for realistic assessment, of the duty officers owed to their country rather than to any individual leader. He did not use the word assassination. He did not have to. Outside the chateau windows, the sky flickered orange with distant fires. The invasion was 1 day old. The longest retreat in German military history had begun. The field hospital had been a schoolhouse once. Now the desks were pushed against the walls, and the floor was covered with wounded men lying on stretchers, blankets, or bare wood. Corporal Werner Hoffmann walked between them, searching for water to bring to those who could still drink. The smell of blood and antiseptic filled his lungs with every breath. He had not slept in 40 hours, dawn was breaking on June 7. The invasion was 30 hours old. Werner had abandoned his radio post when the bunker took a direct hit from naval artillery. 3 of his comrades had died instantly. He had survived only because he had stepped outside to relieve himself. Now he moved through the chaos of the German rear area, a man without a unit, without orders, without purpose. In Berlin, the morning briefings continued with the strange formality that characterized the Nazi high command. Officers in pressed uniforms stood before maps and delivered reports that minimized failures and exaggerated successes. Hitler listened, asked questions, issued directives that had no connection to reality. He ordered the beaches retaken by nightfall. He demanded that not 1 meter of ground be surrendered. He spoke of secret weapons that would soon turn the tide, the V-1 flying bombs, the jet fighters, the wonder weapons that existed mostly in propaganda films. The truth was simpler and more terrible. On the beaches, Allied engineers were already constructing artificial harbors called mulberries, massive floating structures that would allow supplies to flow directly onto the shore without needing to capture a port. Within weeks, these harbors would deliver more tonnage than the Germans thought possible. The beachhead that could have been destroyed on June 6 was becoming an unbreakable fortress. Rommel spent the morning touring forward positions, driving through villages that had become battlefields overnight. He saw the craters left by naval shells, some large enough to swallow a truck. He saw the burned hulks of tanks that had tried to reach the coast and been caught by fighter bombers. He saw the faces of soldiers who had fought through the night without reinforcement, without resupply, without hope of relief. At one command post, a young lieutenant asked Rommel directly what would happen next. The field marshal was silent for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "We will do our duty until it is no longer possible to do anything at all." In the hedgerows of Normandy, the nature of the war was changing. The bocage, dense hedgerows that divided Norman fields into natural fortresses, would slow the Allied advance for weeks to come. German defenders learned to use these terrain features to devastating effect, turning every field into an ambush, every lane into a killing ground. But the defenders were too few, their supplies too thin, their leadership too fractured to do more than delay the inevitable. Werner found himself attached to a scratch unit of survivors from a dozen different formations. Their sergeant was a veteran of Stalingrad who had lost 3 fingers to frostbite and walked with a limp from a Russian bullet still lodged in his thigh. He spoke rarely and never about the future. He taught the younger soldiers how to dig fighting positions that could survive artillery, How to move without being seen, how to survive one more hour and then one more after that. As the sun set on June 7, Werner sat in a foxhole and wrote a letter to his mother in Hamburg. He told her he was safe, that the fighting was not as bad as the newspapers might suggest, that he would be home soon. Every word was a lie. He folded the letter carefully, knowing it would probably never be sent, and tucked it inside his uniform jacket, next to the photograph of his family. In his headquarters, Rommel composed his own report for Berlin. He described the situation in clinical terms: units destroyed, positions lost, supplies exhausted. But between the lines was a message that anyone with eyes could read. The war in the West was lost. The only question was how many more would die before someone accepted this truth. 44 days later, on July 20, a bomb would explode in Hitler's conference room, placed there by officers who had reached the same conclusion Rommel reached on June 6. The plot would fail. Rommel, implicated by the conspirators' confessions, would be given a choice: public trial and execution, or suicide with honors and protection for his family. He chose the poison. He was buried with full military honors while the man he had tried to save Germany from sent flowers to his widow, but that was still in the future. On the night of June 7, 1944, Werner Hoffmann lay in his foxhole and listened to the sound of artillery in the distance. Above him, the stars were hidden by clouds of smoke drifting inland from the beaches. Somewhere out there, American and British soldiers were digging their own foxholes, writing their own letters, wondering if they would see another dawn. The invasion had succeeded. The liberation had begun. And the long, bloody road to Berlin stretched out ahead, paved with the bodies of young men who had no voice in the decisions that sent them to die. Werner closed his eyes and tried to sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring more fighting, more death, more questions that had no answers. The war was lost. The killing went on.